What exactly are Emu's powers? We've seen everything from lasers from the sky to shadow spears and even crazy transformations. And what exactly did Cobra mean by Emu being one of the names of the original 20 kings? Is this shadowy figure really 800 years old, or is there more to the story? Well, let's talk about it. In chapter 1085, we saw all of the literal top brass of the world government turn into these giant shadowy creatures, with Emu looking like a literal monster, like maybe a dragon or Umibozu type design, and the Gorosei each look like different animals. And we particularly saw Emu use what really looks like a devil's tail design to stab Cobra in Sabo. It looks a lot like Moria's attack against Little Oars Jr. in Marineford actually, and we'll get back to that in just a minute. This whole scene reminds me of when we were first introduced to the jailer beasts of Impel Down, who were the first awakened zones that we saw in the story, although kind of unsuccessful because they lost their minds. And it even reminds me a little bit of when we were introduced to the numbers. I mean, hell, we even got a similar image for Lola during Thriller Bark. Oda loves to introduce beastly characters like this first as a silhouette and then trickle in what they really look like over the course of the story. Which is why I'm pretty sure that we'll get to see Saturn's non-silhouetted animal form sometime during Egghead before Oda reveals the rest of the designs over time. But I do think there will be a little more going on when it comes to Emu specifically. I mean, at this point, we might have to wonder if Emu actually just looks like a silhouette, or a shadow maybe. But first, let me talk more about the Gorosei, because on one hand, I want to just say that they're all mythical or ancient zones of some kind. I mean, they even seem to have the god ribbons that we've seen awakened zones like Luffy, Lucci, and Kaku have. But on the other hand, we can't forget this panel from chapter 1075. We saw this mysterious shadow attacking the camera that Shaka was watching, and we really haven't had a clear answer on who this was yet. I mean, we know York is the traitor, of course, but I'm sure Shaka would have been able to tell it was her. I mean, he literally said it was a shadow, so it's gotta be someone or something else. But you know who it does look like? Saturn. Or at least a silhouette or a shadow of him. Maybe I'm biased because I made this image almost 3 months ago now, but I think the stocks are definitely up on this idea. I mean, we know York was working with the Celestial Dragons and sharing information with them, and obviously Saturn is on his way right now. So him helping her out does make some sense. And after what they all looked like in chapter 1085, I think it kinda all lines up. At this point, I think Egghead is probably gonna serve as an appetizer of sorts for the powers that the Gorosei have. I mean, Saturn already served as our introduction to the names of the Gorosei, so I can definitely see him being the first zone power or whatever it is that we see, on top of giving us a taste of what's going on with Emu's shadow powers or whatever they are. I've said this before, but I really want Luffy to punch Saturn like he did Charlos, and maybe Robin can reveal the Ancient Kingdom name or something, which then brings out Saturn's true powers and then causing a Sabaody-like incident, the one that will shock the world apparently. But let's talk more about that shadow, because the question would obviously have to be, if he's still physically on the ship with Kizaru, then how is he controlling a shadow that's already at Egghead? We have to remember that there are two parts to every person, the body and the shadow, and these can be separated. And you can even give a body additional shadows, like with Nightmare Luffy. If you caught my Shanks video from just a couple weeks ago, I laid out a ton of parallels between the Gods Knights and the zombie generals from Thriller Bark that already hinted Emu was using shadow manipulation of some kind, albeit different than Moria's for sure. I don't want to rehash that whole thing, but this Emu-esque shadow that Absalom had stands out even more after this chapter, I think. The main point though is that if that shadow on Egghead is really Saturn's, then Emu might have a role here too. And like I mentioned earlier, Moria's spiky shadow lizard attack looks eerily similar to Emu's attack with the devil tail design. Moria's even has the same pointed tip, but it's just disguised as the lizard's head. I mean, that's almost too spot on if you ask me, considering all the other shadow connections we've talked about. Another attack to think about could be Doflamingo's God Thread versus Luffy during Dressrosa. The hockey-covered ends kind of aesthetically give that same feel, but the real connection is the fact that he used 16 holy bullets to do that attack. 16 is a crucial number for many reasons. When Emu attacked Leloucia in chapter 1060, there were 16 beams of light that rained down. This could be a parallel to the traditional Japanese rising sun flag, which also has 16 rays of light. The name Emu itself could be read as 16, with Mu being 6 and the prefix I meaning 1. Also, when Luffy went back to Marineford to get 3D2Y in the papers, he rang the Ox Bell 16 times, which acted as a declaration of war. Usually it's rung 8 times to ring in the new year and then 8 times to ring out the old, but Luffy did it out of season. I'm not sure how far Oda's gonna take this whole 16 thing, but what I want to focus on is the 16 rays of light from Leloucia, because there are a lot of reasons to think shadows are involved with Imu's power, but at the same time, how do we tie basically laser beams into this as well? Those almost seem like opposing powers in a way. Well, I did do a video about 6 months ago called Sun God Imu that has aged pretty well, so peep that if you want a deeper dive into some of this. But earlier on, I said that there are 2 components to a person, the body and the shadow. But there are also 2 components to every shadow, the light around it and the darkness that is the actual shadow, the place where light isn't, or maybe what you could call the void of light that follows you. Because if you control all of the light in a given area, then you could theoretically control all of the shadows in that area as well. Most shadows in real life aren't a perfect void or whatever because light reflects off of other objects in the environment, which really just make a shadow a more dim but not perfectly dark area behind you. But maybe Imu is a more perfect version of that in some regard, where there is literally no light at all. And that's why they even refer to themselves as Mu, which can mean void or dream. Maybe that sentient silhouette that we know as Imu is nothing more than an earthly personification of something much more grand, like someone with actual sun god-like powers. Also, the name Mu, meaning dream, could be a good connection to Nightmare Luffy as well, which could mean Imu also has multiple shadows within them. And that might be a good connection to the fact that Cobra said Imu was one of the names of the original 20. You could maybe say that the Imu we see is a descendant or something of the original Imu, but I don't think Imu would respond the way they did if Cobra wasn't onto something really important. Such curiosity teeters on impertinence. It will not be dignified with an answer. That sounds like something nobody is allowed to ask about. So among the original 20, we had Lily, someone named Imu, the Don Quixotes, and the other 17 families. But what could have possibly happened that let Imu rise above the rest, that allowed Imu to sit on the empty throne that was supposed to be reserved for nobody? Well, maybe the Imu that we've seen so far isn't just the Imu of 800 years ago, but there's another shadow or even several shadows involved here somewhere. Perhaps the old Imu sought outside help after defeating the ancient kingdom to even supplant their 19 allies in the new world government, almost like Orochi and Kaido in a way, with the Imu of the past being like Orochi, who wanted even more power and sought great outside powers to be the backbone for that, and Mu, or these shadow powers or whatever, would be like Kaido. Having multiple people or personalities involved here would also line up with the fact that Imu spoke about themselves in the third person, which is actually something we've seen one person do in the story quite a bit before, and that's Hina. Hina's biggest quirk is speaking in the third person, but what's interesting is she is also specifically tasked with patrolling near Alabasta, which should raise some eyebrows after all the Lily stuff recently. But she's also known as Black Cage Hina, because she can basically spawn iron bars around people to trap them, kind of. But I'm not really sure what else this could mean for Imu just yet, but I do think it'll be important somehow. But going back to the idea that the original Imu of the 20 Kings played things kind of like Orochi, I think a couple really good parallels here could actually be Stelly and Mr. 9. I know these are like 2 of the most random characters ever, but trust me, it'll make sense. Because Stelly was hyper fixated on sitting on the empty throne during the reverie, even after learning it's a symbol of no king rising above the others, and he's also from Goa Kingdom, which is where Luffy's also from. And he took Sabo's spot in the family after Sabo left early in his childhood. And since Sabo was the one to actually see Imu on the empty throne, there's just a lot of parallels to make there. He's also incredibly weak and someone who doesn't get a lot of respect from anyone pretty much, despite believing himself worthy of being the king of the world, kind of like how Orochi was made to believe he had a rightful spot as shogun because of what Higurashi told him. Stelly would probably need some significant outside power to actually have any chance of usurping the throne and keeping it, kind of like Orochi and Higurashi did with Kaido to battle Odin and the samurai. Perhaps the Imu of 800 years ago did the same thing, working with Mu or whoever it is, to gain enough power to rule over the world government after taking down the ancient kingdom. And as for Mr. 9, he was Vivi's partner during Baroque Works and was dressed as a king basically. Vivi was a traitor to the Baroque Works organization, and we now know Lily was a traitor to the world government back then. Vivi also wore an outfit with a design like Emu's eyes in her introduction, and Baroque has right around 20 top officers like the world government had their original 20. Baroque technically had 23 top officers, but there was a couple traitors and people who eventually switched sides and one who died and was replaced, so I think the parallel still fits there. So for the sake of clarity through the rest of this video, if I say Emu, then I'm talking about the one Cobra mentioned that was of the original 20 from 800 years ago. If I just say Mu, then I'm talking about the black silhouette that we see today that we've been calling Emu, the one that attacked Sabo and such. They refer to themselves as Mu in the third person anyway, and like I mentioned, I think it could just be a Kaido and Orochi situation anyway, where the powers are from Mu or someone controlling the void known as Mu. Although I would really imagine Mu is more of a Blackbeard or Rocks type character than Kaido anyway, but whatever. So if we look at this Vivi and Mr. 9 situation again, it's important to note that they were inside of a whale, and that's also where Vivi met Luffy and the crew. And I'm sure you've heard the idea by now that the One Piece could be inside of a whale. So that could maybe connect to what Lily's blunder was 800 years ago. Maybe Lily was in a similar situation to Vivi, maybe even teamed up with Emu for some kind of mission, but instead of killing this important whale, who I believe to be Davy Jones, she accidentally let it free, thus leaving the One Piece intact and maybe somehow releasing the poneglyphs to the world. As a result of this, perhaps Emu either sought out help from an outside force or was just taken advantage of by this Mu person in that moment. Like how Blackbeard waits till the perfect time to take advantage of every situation, Mu, or whatever their real name is, may have done the same thing. Rocks seem to have attacked at the perfect time in God Valley since the Celestial Dragons and their slaves were away from Marijua, and if Garp and Roger didn't team up, he probably would have been successful. So there's probably someone like that from 800 years ago. If Joy Boy is a Luffy parallel, then there has to be a Blackbeard parallel too, and I doubt it would just be one of the 20 kings. I mean, Blackbeard has the D initial after all, so I suspect that Emu has been controlled or puppeted by the shadow or void powers as some type of vessel or conduit for Mu. Physically, it may be Emu from 800 years ago, but the will and the shadow or whatever it is going to be entirely Mu's. So that leads us to this panel where the Devil Tail attack has a shadow underneath it. I had a few comments saying that this proves Emu can't just be a shadow because how can a shadow have a shadow? But we shouldn't be so quick to judge. If who we see today as Emu is actually the living Emu of 800 years ago, plus a shadow or void or what have you that is Mu, then there would be two shadows. The void in question could even have thousands of shadows maybe. I mean, Luffy had 100 and I think Moria had 1,000, so Emu or Mu having thousands or tens of thousands would kind of make sense, and maybe that's what the Void Century was. And that could be why Emu has such a wide variety of attacks in their arsenal. Luffy was able to use swords when in Nightmare Luffy mode, which is far from normal for him. So if Emu maybe took the shadows from the whole world at some point or something, then they'd have quite a lot of different powers. And Moria showed us that you can even use shadows to contort the body as opposed to the way it's supposed to work normally. And supposedly a body with a soul that's still in it rejects a new shadow after about 10 minutes, which is what we saw with Nightmare Luffy. But if Emu of 800 years ago was some weak-willed person like Stelly or Mr. 9, then it might be easier to control for a Blackbeard-esque character. And I could also see there being a contract of sorts, like how Sugar's fruit worked. I said this in the God's Knights video, so I'll keep it brief, but this panel from Guernica and Drake shows that CP0 may not entirely have their own free will anymore. Drake said he was pursuing his own sense of justice, and Guernica said, "I envy you," which hints that he couldn't pursue it even if he wanted. And we have to wonder how all these losers from CP9 got promoted to CP0 after being hunted down. I mean, if they had to give up some element of their own free will, perhaps tied to their shadow somehow, then that could make sense and also tie into the shadow at Egghead that looks like Saturn. Maybe Emu has a contract or whatever with them as well, which gives them a power boost or something. And I just want to give a shout out to some of Parvision's Shadows theories. A lot of them mix in very well with a lot of the stuff I've been saying lately. He's got a few different videos, so go ahead and check out the playlist down below. But going back to the Baroque work stuff, I mentioned Mr. 9 potentially being a parallel for Emu, but I think Robin is a good parallel for Mu as well. Robin is known as the Devil Child and even used a new demon form against Black Maria, which matches perfectly with the Devil Tail attack that we saw. And Robin will be the one to uncover the true history, which is a great juxtaposition to Emu trying to keep that history from being revealed. But also, Robin has the flower fruit, and with all the talk of lilies lately and the fact Emu was introduced in a flower garden, that has to matter. And remember, her code name was Miss all sun day. Again, maybe hinting that Imu has light powers of some sort. Also, one moment that stands out a lot more now is Robin scoffing at Cobra's claim of protecting the poneglyphs. To Robin, the Nefertari were probably known as one of the original 20 kings, and thus she assumed they were probably the bad guys throughout history. But once she learns that they actually have the initial D, I bet everything is going to fall into place for her. I'm sure Oda's going to give us that reaction eventually, so be on the lookout. At this point, I think it's looking like the initial D might have been Lily's version of putting the X's on their arms. It's a symbol of their friendship that would only be obvious if you knew what it meant already. Asking if Lily has the initial D is like asking Vivi if she had an X on her arm back then. But the question is, why D? Why specifically that letter, and what does it mean? Well, that could all tie to the fact that Vivi first met Luffy inside of a whale. Vivi was never really with Baroque Works and trying to achieve what they wanted to achieve, but at the same time, she was going through the motions hoping to get a chance to take out Crocodile. But meeting Luffy inside of Laboon obviously changed all of that. So maybe Lily also met Joy Boy inside of a whale, and I think that whale would be Davy, or Davy Jones. And the D became a symbol of their friendship with that whale and a promise to come back to him because he also has the One Piece inside of him. We also know Lily was responsible for the poneglyphs being scattered in some great blunder, and Vivi was meant to hunt Laboon on her original mission. So maybe Lily failed to do the same thing, but on purpose with Davy. That would also hint that there was a premeditated plan of some sort, and a very detailed one at that. And discussing that plan inside of a whale would be the perfect place to do that because nobody would be able to hear it. And I'm not just saying because you can go under the sea like a submarine, but we've seen a few times that living creatures are great at hiding intel or conducting surprise attacks. In Skypiea, Enel's island-wide mantra didn't work if you were inside of Nola, the snake. Likewise, Isa couldn't detect anything outside of Nola after she was eaten. Zunisha's hidden a road poneglyph for 800 years that even Blackbeard doesn't know the whereabouts of, at least the last we heard. And Luffy even surprised Hody while hiding inside of a shark, so I think you get the idea. And we know Enel has strong parallels to Emu, or Mu I guess, so let's just say that during the Void Century, or the Mu Century, Mu was able to hear and detect everything around the world just like Enel. So being inside of a living creature like a whale may be the only place to talk without being heard. But then in comes Lily and her Mr. 9 parallel, Emu, who was just one of the original 20 at this point during the Void Century. By venturing inside of the whale with Lily, Emu would have known at least some of what they discussed, and perhaps that's the reason Mu took over Emu's body specifically. They had basically the only missing information, and like I said earlier, it could have been a punishment of some sort for failing that mission. And lastly, I want to say that whether Emu's powers are just from a devil fruit or some kind of technology, hockey, a new species or something, I'm not really sure. I would expect it to tie to devil fruit since they have just been such an important thing throughout the story, but I'm sure Oda would do something more special than just some ultimate devil fruit or something. I would almost like something more basic to mirror Luffy's basic rubber powers. I mean, obviously Luffy's fruit has been revealed to be the Sun God fruit, but it's still just rubber powers. And maybe Emu having Sun God powers through some more basic means would make sense as well. Kev DOG brought up ink powers during his stream, which I liked a lot. I mean, I think at a minimum, there's just a parallel to make there between shadows and ink, since shadows can kind of dictate your movement, like ink dictates what things look like on a manga page. But there's also some issues with that, like the fact it's similar to Kanjuro's fruit, so I'm not really sure. But I do think holograms are an interesting idea, since we learned a lot about those in Egghead, and Atlas talked about what's real and not, and how that's been decided for them. It's similar to ink in that you can create whatever you imagine, except it's light-based, which ties into all the sun god themes I've been talking about. And maybe those photonic gloves from Egghead would come in handy then. I mean, it would be an interesting battle of imagination between Luffy and Emu if that was the case. But hey, that's it for this video, guys. If this felt rushed, I apologize. I did have to kind of hurry on this one, but I felt like it would be a crime to not talk about this chapter after all the shadow stuff. So hey, please hit like and subscribe and all that YouTube stuff if you wouldn't mind. But until next time, later.